For centuries, anyone who studied the Gospels did so under the assumption that they was, pardon the expression, the gospel truth. But lately, some folks has been studying the Gospels without that assumption, and that makes apologists sad. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. Last time, Dr. Craig gave us his best smooth-talking salesman bit to try and get us to buy into the idea that we ought to evaluate the historicity of the Gospels with a frankly gullible bias. I mean, he didn't actually use the term gullible, he just said we ought to assume that everything in the Gospels is true unless and until it can be proven to be false, just because the Gospel writer says so. And that's basically what gullibility is. Of course, that ain't how genuine historians does actual history. They don't assume that the stories is either true or false. They just take each claim and look for real-world data that either corroborates or disconfirms the claim. In other words, they take an approach that's as unbiased and neutral as possible. And even Dr. Craig agreed towards the end that, well, you could take a neutral approach instead of being openly biased in favor of believing the Gospels. But even here, he has some definite preferences as to how exactly he wants us to go about being, quote-unquote, neutral. Quote, now, if we do adopt a position of neutrality when approaching the Gospels, how do we move beyond neutrality to the affirmation that some event is actually historical? Scholars have developed a number of so-called criteria of authenticity to enable us to do that. End quote. So, even if we do give in and try and take a neutral approach, it's still supposed to be just one step in our progress towards affirming that the event actually is historical. He don't say that being neutral means determining whether the event is or is not historical. His goal is to, quote, move beyond neutrality to the affirmation, end quote. So he ain't actually being neutral here. He's still bound and determined to reach the goal of declaring the Gospels to be historical. He's just adopting a neutral pose so's he can pretend that he ain't just being biased. Even though he said last time that being biased was better. But now let's talk about these so-called criteria of authenticity. And notice that's his language, not mine. He's the one calling them so-called criteria of authenticity. Which kind of gives you the impression he ain't real fond of them. And there's a reason for that. The way he's presenting them makes it sound like they're some kind of rigorous analytical method used by historians in order to determine whether or not a given story is factual. But that ain't exactly what they is. If you look up the phrase criteria of authenticity online, you're going to find that it's a term that comes up exclusively in the context of apologetics and New Testament studies. And that's because the phrase comes from critical scholars questioning the Gospels, trying to separate the things that Jesus actually said from the things that was attributed to him later on as embellishments and urban legends. And obviously that ain't an approach that Dr. Craig's going to be too fond of, which is why he can't help but refer to them as so-called criteria of authenticity. Well, then again, you don't get to be an apologist to Dr. Craig's stature by running away from a challenge, so he's going to try and do what apologists loves best, which is to try and take an argument against the reliability of the Gospels and turn it into an argument for the Gospels, using the critics' own arguments against them. So even though they's so-called criteria, he presents them as being a way that we can move beyond neutrality to the affirmation that the events in the Gospels is actual history. Quote, it's vital that these criteria be properly stated and understood, for they've often been grossly misused. End quote. I'll take self-fulfilling prophecies for $500, Alex. The problem with the criteria of authenticity is that when it comes right down to it, there's far too much subjectivity involved, too much guesswork and questionable assumptions. And that's why apologists can use them to argue in favor of the Gospels being reliable, even though the criteria themselves was developed by liberal critical scholars. But the argument Dr. Craig is building here is that, oh no, the criteria is perfectly legit. It's just that them doggone critical scholars is misusing them. And he's going to remedy that by using these same criteria to draw conclusions that contradicts the folks that invented them. He continues, quote, "The criteria are really signs of historical credibility. A story in the Gospels exhibiting one of these signs is, all things being equal, more likely to be historical than it would have been without it." End quote. And the catch here is that all things ain't never going to be equal. That's why scholars who use these criteria ain't been spectacularly successful in making conclusive distinctions between what's genuinely historical and what ain't. The best they could do is declare that this or that passage is probably more likely to be an authentic saying of Jesus, but it's subjective and depends on a lot of unprovable assumptions. Dr. Craig goes on to list 6 of what he calls some of the more important criteria, but before we get to that, I want to skip ahead a bit for some additional comments he makes about the group as a whole. Quote, "Notice a couple of things about these criteria. First, they're all positive signs of historical credibility. Therefore, they can only be used to establish the historicity of some incident, not to deny it." End quote. And you gotta love them scare quotes around the word criteria. He's really struggling with the cognitive dissonance of trying to defend the techniques used by liberal critical scholars while at the same time rejecting their conclusions pretty much in their entirety. But he has to make it sound like the liberal scholars got it right in order for this bit to work. So he grits his teeth and pushes on. And of course, he frames it in terms of shifting the burden of proof. His arguments leading up to this point has established the principle that believers is supposed to believe whatever the gospel says unless and until it can be proven false. And now he wants us to understand that these criteria can't be used to prove the gospel's false. So heads I win, tails you lose. The gospels is only ever allowed to be true according to the rules as Dr. Craig has defined them. Meanwhile, the reasonable conclusion to draw for sayings of Jesus that fail to meet the criteria is that we can't tell if Jesus really said them or not. And if we ain't committed up front to believing everything the gospel says, that's pretty damaging. How's we supposed to obey the teachings of Jesus if we can't even know for sure what he taught? So you can see why Dr. Craig works so hard to stack the deck in favor of taking a gullible approach to the gospel. Once you admit that there's legitimate questions about the New Testament narrative, you open up a whole can of worms that he don't want believers opening up, because that's a road that could lead to deconstruction and a loss of faith. The damage control continues in his second point. Quote, "Second, the criteria don't presuppose the general reliability of the Gospels. The criteria apply to specific incidents, not to a whole book. So they can be used to detect historical nuggets of information in any source, even the apocryphal Gospels or the Quran." End quote. And technically, he's correct that they could be applied to other texts like the Quran, but in actual fact, as far as I know, they ain't. This is strictly a New Testament studies technique in practice. And for once, Dr. Craig is willing to concede that the approach historians actually use is the correct approach. For most of this chapter, he's been arguing that we ought to take the Gospels as an indivisible unit that's either entirely reliable or entirely unreliable. But now that he's gritting his teeth and trying to use the approach that liberal critical scholars use, he's willing to say that it's okay to look at the individual details on their own merits. And the only reason he's willing to do that is because he's stacked the deck by saying that it can only help confirm the gospel, not disprove it. So now let's go back and look at these 6 criteria and see what makes them so unreliable as a research tool and so irresistible to apologists. Quote, number 1, historical fit. The incident fits in with known historical facts of the time and place. End quote. So right away, the very first criterion falsifies Dr. Craig's claim that these criteria can't be used to disprove the authenticity of an event reported in the Gospels. Historical fit, at best, can only demonstrate that it ain't impossible for the story to be true. But on the other hand, if in the story don't fit the historical facts, then we can be pretty confident that it ain't true. For example, one gospel says Jesus was born during the reign of King Herod, but another says he was born when Quirinius was governor of Syria. They can't both be true because Herod died about 10 years before Quirinius became governor. At least one of the 2 stories can't be authentic. Next criterion, quote, number 2, independent early sources. The incident is related in multiple sources which are near to the time when the incident is said to have occurred and which don't rely on each other or on a common source. End quote. And here's where the guesswork and assumptions comes in, because the written accounts that we has today was only written down after decades of the gospel being spread by word of mouth. Plus, Luke begins his gospel by saying that there was many other accounts written down before his, and we ain't got most of those. So there ain't no way we can analyze the spread of the story and find out who was copying from who. The data just ain't there no more. Next criterion, quote, number 3, embarrassment. The incident is awkward or counterproductive for the early Christian church. End quote. And this one's a favorite of apologists because it's so easy to claim that this or that story would have been subjectively embarrassing to early Christians. And obviously, that's both speculative and subjective. For example, apologists likes to claim that early Christians would have been embarrassed by stories about the disciples squabbling with each other or misunderstanding Jesus, and therefore the only reason they'd have included these stories was because they was true. But this overlooks a couple of things. First of all, the stories weren't written by the folks that's portrayed in a bad light by the stories, so it wouldn't necessarily have been embarrassing to the folks that was writing them. Second, and more importantly, this overlooks the central role that before and after stories plays in apologetic testimony, especially in the context of extreme cognitive dissonance. We've seen this multiple times in recent years when folks has predicted that Jesus was coming back on such and such a date, Harold Camping being a prominent example. When Jesus failed to return on the date that Camping predicted, Camping went back and said, "Oh, okay, I miscalculated, I misinterpreted the scripture, but I see my mistake now." And then he predicted a new date, which also failed. And he did that a few times before he finally gave up. But the point is, you has to admit that you made a mistake before you can claim that you see where you made your mistake. And that's what we have in the Gospels. The end of the world didn't happen when the disciples thought it would. And in fact, kind of the opposite happened. The only way they could deal with that much cognitive dissonance was to go back and say, "Oh, I see. We completely misunderstood what Jesus was really trying to tell us." It's just a before and after story, like you hear in testimonies about what awful enemies of God somebody was before Jesus saved them. That ain't embarrassment. That's a narrative device about how life-changing the gospel is supposed to be. If you's giving your testimony, you ain't going to be embarrassed about how bad you was before. If anything, you's going to want to exaggerate what an awful sinner you was, so God can look greater by saving you. Anyway, next criterion. Quote, number 4, dissimilarity. The incident is unlike earlier Jewish ideas and or unlike later Christian ideas. End quote. And this one might be the most hopeless criterion of them all. I mean, sure, it sounds kind of plausible at first glance. Jesus started a new religion, so anything he says that don't fit the old religion probably really is something he said. And if he's quoted as saying something that contradicts later Christians, they probably wouldn't have preserved it unless it was authentic. Or so it would seem. But this falls apart under closer examination. First of all, it assumes that first century Judaism was monolithic enough that you could tell when something was dissimilar with it. And that ain't the case at all. Judaism was largely based on ethnicity and ritual, not doctrinal uniformity. As long as you was born to Jewish parents and or keeping the Sabbaths and other laws, you could believe pretty much anything and still be Jewish. And this means that first century Jews didn't just tolerate diversity of religious opinion, they thrived on it. It made the religion interesting and gave them something to talk about on the Sabbath. So saying that something sounds dissimilar to what the Jews believed is kind of like saying some political opinion sounds dissimilar to what Americans believe. As soon as you say that ain't what they believed, you're going to find some who did believe exactly that. And as for Jesus saying something that conflicts with later Christian beliefs, well, who's to say there's an actual conflict there? Christians is famous for being able to reconcile whatever the Bible teaches with how they actually behave. Otherwise, the discrepancy wouldn't be there. If in the New Testament reports Jesus as having taught something or done something, it's because the story was popular among certain first century believers. Now, we could assume that if a story was more popular, it's because it was more authentic, but that's an assumption without a foundation in real-world data. All it really says is that folks like to believe that Jesus said it or did it, and that don't reliably tell us whether he actually did or not. Let's continue. Quote, number 5, Semitisms. Traces of Hebrew or Aramaic language, spoken by Jesus' countrymen, appear in the story. End quote. And again, sounds plausible. If you take a story written in Aramaic and translate it into Greek, sometimes there's expressions and ways of phrasing things that's common in Aramaic and not in Greek. So as if you're familiar with both languages, you can say, this sounds like it was translated from the Aramaic. The problem is that this don't necessarily mean Jesus was the one who originally said it. At best, this can only tell us that the original story was written or told in Aramaic before it was translated to Greek. And that ain't surprising at all in a religion that got started in Palestine. Now, could it be possible that the story or quotation was in Aramaic because it was originally spoken by Jesus? Well, sure, but possible don't mean more likely. We still don't know whether Jesus really said it or whether this is an embellishment by somebody who happened to speak Aramaic. And that's kind of the whole point of this criterion. We need for it to say that it is or is not more likely to be authentic. And it just can't do that. It's still just guesswork. And lastly, quote, number 6, coherence. The incident fits in with facts already established about Jesus, end quote. And there's 2 problems here. One is that in order for a story to fit in with facts already established about Jesus, you has to have facts that's already established about Jesus. And there ain't nearly as many of those as apologists would like us to believe. And secondly, this is another one that falsifies Dr. Craig's claim that these criteria can't be used to disprove the Gospels. If a story is consistent with what we know about Jesus, the most we can know for sure is that it ain't impossible for it to be authentic. But on the other hand, if it ain't consistent with what we know about Jesus, then at the very least it's less likely to be authentic, contrary to what Dr. Craig is arguing. So all in all, I'm inclined to refer to these 6 criteria as so-called criteria, just like Dr. Craig did. I don't think there's enough substance there to justify the claim that they tell us anything useful. There's just a framework for expressing opinions, and that's pretty much it. Which is why apologists can't resist the temptation to try and exploit them for their own purposes. And Dr. Craig's purpose, in this case, is to try and argue that Jesus really did, in fact, claim to be God. Quote, it's worth noting a general problem facing critics who deny that Jesus made any radical claims at all. We know from Paul's letters that within 20 years of Jesus' death, Jesus was regarded and worshipped by his contemporaries as God incarnate, Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 7, end quote. And honestly, I couldn't ask for a better example of how stories grows with the retelling. We're going to have a look at what Paul actually wrote in just a minute, but first, let's consider what Dr. Craig is claiming here. Because he's claiming that the very first generation of Christians believed that Jesus was God incarnate, and that just ain't true, historically speaking. Christians was arguing among themselves for literally centuries about exactly who and what Jesus was. They wouldn't have done that if in the very first generation of believers had unanimously proclaimed him to be God. But notice how Dr. Craig phrased it. He didn't specify that all early believers agreed that Jesus was God incarnate. He's a debater. He knows how to leave room for plausible deniability. So he just says Jesus was worshipped as God by his contemporaries. And that way, if somebody calls him on it, he can just say that he meant, well, there was some early believers who called him God. But on the other hand, if nobody does call him out, believers is going to think that it was all early Christians. And when they retell the story to someone else, they're going to say everybody in the first century knew that he was God incarnate. And that is precisely how legends grow and develop. So let's have a look at what Paul actually wrote so as we can see what a tiny amount of material is required in order for a motivated apologist to build a legend as big as God incarnate. Here's Philippians 2, starting in verse 5. Quote, "Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, as he already existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a bondservant and being born in the likeness of men." End quote. So clearly, Paul is talking about Jesus as having some kind of pre-incarnate existence that Paul describes as being the form of God. But notice that ain't the same thing as actually being God. It's an expression, like saying that man is made in the image of God. And I was really fighting the temptation to dig into what Paul really did mean here, but I was just going to tiptoe around that particular rabbit hole. It's sufficient for our purposes to remember that controversies over who Jesus was arose among believers who'd been taught personally by Paul and had face-to-face conversations with him. If Paul had been teaching that Jesus was literally God incarnate, the first several hundred years of church history would have been very different. Also, Dr. Craig only references verses 5 through 7, but let's go on ahead and read the next two verses. Quote, "And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, death on a cross. For this reason, also, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name." End quote. So God and Jesus is definitely two different entities here. God's the subject and Jesus is the object. And God's exalting him, which he wouldn't need to do if Jesus was God, since he'd already be the Most High. Jesus is being exalted by God. He ain't the incarnation of God, at least according to what Paul's writing here. And remember, Paul is writing almost 300 years before the church come up with the notion that God was a Trinity, which, by the way, is kind of ironic in the light of Dr. Craig's earlier argument that it takes hundreds of years for legends to form, and, well, it turns out that's how long it took for the doctrine of the Trinity to come up. But the main point here is that neither Paul nor his audience was Trinitarians, because at that time it hadn't even been invented yet. And you can't refer to something that neither you nor your audience has ever heard of. So Paul ain't referring to any Trinity here, no matter what modern-day retcons might try to tell us. And yet, because Paul made an obscure passing reference to the form of God in a passage about believers being humble, Dr. Craig builds out this anachronistic legend about the original Christian church believing that Jesus was God incarnate, even though we know it took them literal centuries to come to that conclusion. He's taken a single phrase whose intended meaning is debatable and blown it all out of proportion to what Paul actually said. And that's a brilliant demonstration of how stories evolve to fit strong religious beliefs. This is exactly the mechanism by which a few motivated apologists back in the first century could have taken a story about dreams and visions of Jesus being alive and evolved it into a story about a full-blown, literal, physical resurrection that never historically actually happened. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Dr. Craig is going to try and prove that Jesus really did claim to be God while glossing over the difficulties presented by the actual texts. And I was going to be showing him the devil in the details. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.